Welcome. I'm Professor Josh Clinton from Vanderbilt University. Today we're going to talk about election administration. So in particular, we're going to talk about who votes and how they're able to vote, and what we know about those processes and those effects. So recall, everything goes back in the United States to the U.S. Constitution. And so here's the relevant aspect, Article 1, Section 4. That reminds us that the time, places, and manners of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. What Article 1, Section 4 establishes is that the rules of the game, the rules of which you do elections, is a combination of both state rules and also federal rules. And so today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about some of those rules that are important for understanding how elections are done. So in particular, we're going to focus on two aspects. The first question is, who can vote? So we're going to look at questions about voter registration lists and how that varies across states, voter ID laws, and whether convicted felons are able to vote or not. And also how you vote, right? Whether you vote by mail, the effect of different polling places, and the effect of voting machines and ballots. So again, all of these are either controlled by the federal government, but more often than not, they're left to the devices of the state legislature under the Constitution. So you'll see that there's a huge variety of how individuals vote in the United States and how they participate in the political process. And understanding some of those differences is what we're going to cover today. So again, we're not necessarily going to talk about whether the rules are good or bad. And we're not even going to get much depth into what the effects of those are on our election outcomes. Instead, the point of the lecture is to make you aware that there's important differences across states and even across time in the rules in terms of who can participate and how you participate that may matter for elections. So again, our point is emphasizing how the construction of rules occurs and how they vary across states and across time, not in evaluating whether those rules are good or bad necessarily. So another important point is that there's other things that we're not going to talk about. So gerrymandering, or the questions of other alternatives for voting, such as ranked voting that's being used in Maine, we're not going to cover those. So those are really critically important, but we're just not going to talk about them in this particular lecture. So let's start by just thinking about turnout over time. So this is a graph that graphs the voting eligible public from 1789 to 2018. So the blue lines are presidential elections, the red lines are midterm elections. And so you can see that, not surprisingly, for recent periods, there's more political participation in presidential elections than midterm elections. Moreover, you can see that there's certain trends that are going on. So in the 1850s, 1870s, and 1900s, in presidential elections, among those who were eligible to vote, that was nearly 80%. That number has fallen, so nowadays we're about 60% in presidential elections and roughly 40% in midterm elections, although the 2018 midterm election actually had record turnout for the time, and we crested 50%. So just put some context here. So you can see that the Jim Crow laws, right, that were existing in the South, limiting the ability of blacks to participate, were roughly from 1865 to 1968, all those debates about the starting period and the ending period of that. But broadly speaking, you can see that this is when those are occurring, just by contact patterns that you see. Women were given the vote in the 19th Amendment in 1920, starting here. And the 26th Amendment that lowered the voting age to the 18-year-olds was enacted in 1971. Right? So again, here's the context of voting in the United States across time, overlay with some critical aspects that are relevant for understanding the potential patterns that we're observing here. Right? Jim Crow laws in terms of the ability of blacks to participate in the political system, right? Whether or not women could participate in the political system, and then also whether or not 18-year-olds could participate in the political system, and 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds. So again, given that this is what voting looks like, let's talk a little bit about how that may impact things. So we're going to focus primarily on elections in contemporary periods, but again, I think it's useful for some context to understand how important state laws can be. So there's perhaps no more important policy in terms of the impact that it had on voting than the Jim Crow laws that were occurred during the South in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So here's a graph showing, for example, black and white voter registration rates in Louisiana. And what you can see is that participation rates were pretty high, right, during 1878, 1880, 1890. And then notice what happens in the 1900 elections. White participation stabilizes at 60%. It falls, but doesn't fall that tremendously. Among blacks, right, participation rate is like less than 5%. So the participation rate that is low all the way to the 1940s slowly increases. Here's the Voting Rights Act, which we'll talk about, until finally now it's kind of closing the gap that it originally had. So again, states are given the power to regulate elections, and this can have dramatic consequences in who's able to vote. So understanding the process and some of the rules that are used is really critically important for understanding that. It's not just the federal government, but a lot of the rules are done at the state level, and who's in control of the state government and the incentives that they have can matter tremendously for those systems. So another example here that we don't talk about anymore are poll taxes. So it used to be the case in some states that you had to pay in order to cast a vote. So here's an example from Davidson County, where Vanderbilt University is located. In 1941, they had a female poll tax. Right? So if you're a female and you wanted to go to the poll, you had to pay $1. Here's in Chattanooga, 1877, you had to pay 50 cents, right, to vote if you're a male. And here's from the rule from Maine, right, that was taken off the state books in 1973, that a poll tax of $3 shall be assessed to every male resident in the state between the ages of 21 and 70. So poll taxes were something that state legislatures could impose because they control the power of the elections. So poll taxes in particular were repealed in 1962 with the 24th Amendment. Here's the actual language itself. But again, it highlights how important it is to understand both what states are doing, but then what also the federal government is doing. So another example where the federal government has stepped in, that's important to give context for where we are today, is to think about the Voting Rights Act. So here's Lyndon Johnson talking with Martin Luther King on August 6, 1965, when he signed the Voting Rights Act into law. So again, the Voting Rights Act was partially a result of the graph I showed you earlier, where participation as a result of Jim Crow laws was very, very low among blacks in the South in particular. So what did the voting rights do? So what the voting rights did is really important because it reasserted federal power over those states. Right? And again, under the Constitution, all powers are originally given to state legislatures, but the federal government can step in and make amendments to that and kind of overrule what the states are going to do. And so in particular, what Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act did, it seems very technical, but it's actually really super important. It made it that any changes that were made to election law, in terms of voting ID, voting registration, polling places, all had to be reviewed by the federal government. So this is a massive step in from the federal government. They go from a system where the states are left to do anything to the Voting Rights Act, and Section 5 in particular empowered the federal government to make sure to give oversight through the Department of Justice all the activities that related to the regulation of elections by the states themselves. Right? So here you can see, for example, that it froze the changes in the election practices and procedures until the new procedure had been determined either after administrative review by the Attorney General or after a lawsuit to have neither discriminatory purpose or effect. So again, it's to ensure that the voting changes that were being made at the state level did not violate the Constitution according to the Attorney General or the court system in the United States. So how broadly was that construed? So in Allen versus State Board of Education, what the Supreme Court did is they gave that a huge broad interpretation. So basically any change affecting voting, even though it appears to be minor or indirect, returns to a prior practice or procedure, ostensibly expands voting rights, or is designed to remove the elements that cause objection by the Attorney General prior to the change, is subject to Section 5 review or requirement. So again, that's technical, but what it basically means is that any change, right, that could potentially affect the ability to vote would be subject to review under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So again, this is pulled from the Department of Justice webpage in 2020, and this is how they characterized the laws that were operating under the time. So it used to be the case that states could do whatever they wanted to regulate voting. The Voting Rights Act basically froze all the procedures and then made any new procedures subject to review by the Department of Justice or through the court system. So who was affected by this? And so originally, not every state was considered, but only those who had registration or turnout rates below 50% in 1964, and also devices, right, according to legislation to discourage voting like literacy tests were covered. So you can see originally which states were covered, and it's largely in the South. In an amendment in 1970 or 1975, right, they also kind of added English language tests with the growing Hispanic population in the United States that were voting to extend the coverage there. And then some states who could show that they were free of violations for 10 years would be bailed out or no longer covered. So for example, you can see there's a bunch of places in New England that originally had voting rights or registration that's less than 50%, but after 10 years there was no violations, and so they were slowly removed. So this was the status, is that as a result of the legislation being done by the federal government, imposing oversight on what states were doing, it turned out that some states were entirely covered by Voting Rights Act. And other states were added over time as the Voting Rights Act was amended and kind of reauthorized. So this gave rise to a really important question. So it then came to the Supreme Court by Shelby County, Alabama, who sued as to whether or not it should be covered by the Department of Justice. So in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 is a really critically important Supreme Court case. So here, Shelby County said that it should not be subject to the oversight of the federal government when determining how people should vote. And the Supreme Court agreed. And it basically said those jurisdictions that were identified by the coverage formula in Section 4B, again, technical terms, basically the map I just showed you, would no longer need to seek the approval of the federal government and the Department of Justice in particular before making any changes. So again, prior to 2013, if you were in one of those covered states, right, or if you were in a county in a covered state, in some states like North Carolina where some places were covered and some places were uncovered, right, you couldn't make any changes that affected the ability of people to vote without getting approval of the federal government and the Department of Justice. After Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, that requirement was taken away. Right? So it's no longer the case that states need to seek approval before making changes to how elections are done in terms of voter registration, in terms of polling places, in terms of voter ID, and so forth. So again, critically important case because it highlights the dance that we have in the United States between state power and federal power, and who's controlling and has the ability to write the laws that impact political participation. So again, that's by way of context for understanding where we are now, but it's really super important. We have the federal government, but most things that relate to the election, especially after Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, are left up to the states. And as a result of that, you see a lot of variation in terms of the ability of voters to vote and who's able to vote and how they vote that varies by state and is not uniform at all. And so when people complain, why is it so different across the states? It's because of the Constitution, because that's what the Constitution says, and also because of Shelby County versus Holder in the cases of potential voting rights discrimination acts that were occurring in the South in particular. Let's start by asking the question, who can vote, and look at the issue of voter registration. This is left up to the states. So the rules of voter registration vary tremendously across states. So this tells you whether or not states have same-day registration or not. So in some places, so for example, Michigan, on election day, you can walk up to the polls, register to vote, and cast your ballot. In other states like Kentucky, Kansas, Virginia, and Tennessee, you have to do that in advance. So if you're not registered to vote before Election Day, you're out of luck. And the number of days you have to be registered ahead of Election Day also varies considerably across states. So again, that's all given to the Constitution. States are free to do what they do, and there's lots of differences in what the states have chosen to do in terms of allowing voters to register on the same day as Election Day or not. There's differences across states in the ability to get registered on Election Day. There's also variation in terms of whether or not identification is required to cast a ballot. So here, there's considerable variation. So in a state like Tennessee, for example, we have what's called a strict voter ID, which means that not only do you need identification to vote, but you need specific forms of identifications. For example, a driver's license. If you have a college student with a college ID, that doesn't count. In other states, such as Maine, New York, and Pennsylvania, you don't need anything to vote. You can just show up, you don't have to show any identification, you just cast your ballot. In others, you need an identification, but it's not strict, right? It doesn't need to be a photo identification. In other ways, you can have your photo ID requested, but it's not mandated, right? So if you walk up to the vote, you might be asked, can you show your identification? But it's not required for you to actually cast your vote. So again, there's tremendous variability here across the states. And you can ask why there's such variations and whether this is good or bad, but that's not what we're going to talk about, right? The point is that the states have chosen, because they are allowed to have very different rules in terms of what it requires to cast the vote on Election Day. It's not all uniform, nor is it obviously partisan, right, as you look at that. Both Democrats and Republican states, controlled states, have differences in how they vote. And so one thing that we again see tremendous variation across states is whether or not those convicted of a felony are allowed to cast a vote. So if you live in the state of Maine or Vermont, you never lose your right to vote. Right? Doesn't matter if you are a convicted felon, doesn't matter if you're in jail or serving time presently, you're still allowed to vote. Other places, if you're a convicted felon, you lose the vote while you're serving time, but once you get out of jail, you can vote again. Other places, you have automatic restoration once you get out of vote. Still others require you go through a process by which you get your voting rights back. You have to appeal and be approved by the system to have your voting rights restored. So again, whether or not a felon is able to vote varies tremendously on the state that they live in. Right? If you're in Maine and Vermont, you never lose your vote to vote. If you live in a state like Florida or Tennessee, right, you're going to be much more subject to losing your vote if you're convicted of a felony in the state. So as you can see, there's tremendous variability in the extent to which a convicted felon is able to vote And so as you can see here, over time, this is becoming increasingly large. So currently in 2016, it's estimated that 6.1 million individuals were convicted felons and unable to vote in the presidential election. So again, this matters because you have variation across states. State legislatures determine who's able to vote and who's not able to vote, and in particular whether convicted felons and the conditions under which they're able to vote. And this is increasingly consequential across time. So 6.1 million individuals are currently unable to vote because of the rules that are being performed in their state legislatures. Now, this also has tremendous racial consequences if you think about who's being impacted by these felon disenfranchisement laws. So this graph up here shows the percentage of black individuals who are disenfranchised because of a felony conviction in 1980. And what you can see is there's a tremendous variation across states because there's differences in the state rules there. But the maximum number of percentages was about roughly 13% of individuals who were disenfranchised by the state laws that were in place at the time. Fast forward to 2016 and you see a very different picture, right? The numbers and percentages have all increased pretty dramatically. In fact, now the maximum state goes from about 13% in 1980 to 26% in 2016. So again, the state laws that are being chosen have dramatic consequences and have dramatic consequences by race on whether or not they allow felons to be able to vote or not. So just to put in additional context, at least 5% of black individuals in the state were disenfranchised in 1980. In 2016, that number rises to 23 states. So in 23 states, there are currently 5% of black voters that are not able to vote because of felony convictions that they have. In the state of Tennessee, we're pretty high, and that number is 21%. So again, the rules the state has dramatic consequences on who's able to vote. And that varies tremendously across states. And so if you want to think about who has to vote, again, a lot of power is still given to state legislatures, and the rules that they make can have a dramatic impact on what the composition of the electorate looks like. So that's talking a little bit about who's able to vote. So now let's talk about the process about how you vote. And this, again, varies, not surprisingly, across states dramatically. And so this talks about the question about mail-in balloting, a really critical issue leading up to the 2020 election. So here you have states that automatically mail out ballots. So what the state is doing is it's going through the list of registered voters in the state and mailing everyone who's a registered voter a ballot so they can vote by mail. Other ones allow mail-in voting for everyone, right? Including some that require justifications for absentee voting, but now they're allowing a COVID-19 fear to justify that. And then some of them require a justification for mail-in voting. So for example, to take our own home state of Tennessee, in Tennessee you can request an absentee ballot and vote by mail, but being fearful of catching COVID-19 is not a valid excuse in Tennessee, whereas it is a valid excuse in Illinois or Kentucky or West Virginia. To be honest, we don't really know what the consequences of this are going to be, right? So we've had some mail-in voting before, we've had absentee voting before, but we've never had anything in such a broad scope and so many states doing it, many times for the first time, right? Which could make for a very interesting election night or election week, and hopefully not election month, but it'll be interesting all the same. So just to give some context, so this shows you how much vote is typically cast before election day. So there's three different types of votes. So these are percent early votes. So in 2016, 17.2% of the votes were cast early. So what that means is that's largely in person. So in a state like Tennessee or North Carolina, you can go to the polls in advance of election day to cast your ballot. You have to be there in person, right, and follow all the other rules about registration and voter ID, but nonetheless, you're able to cast your ballot before election day. And in 2016, that was 17.2%, right? The highest it's been since 2004, right? So people are taking advantage of that, not just voting on election day, but voting earlier. 5.9% voted entirely by mail. So there are 3 states prior to 2020 where every voter voted by mail: Washington, Oregon, and Colorado. So in those states, every single voter would be mailed the ballot, and they return the ballot by voting those. So that was 6% of the electorate, and 17.7% would vote by absentee ballot. So what absentee ballot is that typically the voter requests to vote by mail, they're sent a ballot, and then they return it. So again, they're both voting by mail, but they're slightly different. A mail-in ballot, typically what happens is that every registered voter in the state is sent a ballot that they return. An absentee ballot is different because voters have to make the request of the state, and then they're able to return that ballot itself. So all the same, if you look across the entire range though, nearly 40% of votes were not cast in person on election day in 2016. So we'll see what that number looks like in 2020, but it's going to be a market change, I suspect. So again, vote by mail and absentee votes had been used in the past, but never to the extent that we suspect they're going to be used in 2020 election. And so we'll see what happens with that. So here's just, again, highlighting the fact that there's tremendous variation in terms of how people vote across different states. So this is the percentage of votes that are either early mail or absentee. And so you see Colorado, 94.4% were all cast by mail, 100% in Oregon, 97.7% in Washington State. So primarily, everyone's mailed a ballot, and they kind of return their ballot via the mail. In other states, there's more variety here. So Tennessee, for example, in 2016, 66% of the votes were cast either by early mail or absentee. So primarily those either vote by early vote or vote by absentee, because Tennessee didn't allow vote by mail. And so you can see here, the numbers vary tremendously. And so these are all the states that cast more than 50% of their votes not on Election Day. So again, in the United States, increasingly Election Day is not meaning Election Day. Instead, people are making up their mind and they're submitting their ballot earlier before Election Day, which gives you more time, so it doesn't make the election tied to one day, but it also means that late-breaking events in the campaign may be mitigated. There's less of an effect, because if I already cast my ballot and something happens at the last minute, I can't change. My vote's locked in. So again, not saying whether this is good or bad, just saying that as a fact of the elections, that voting early by mail and by absentee is increasingly a large proportion of the United States. So it's also interesting to note that the support for vote by mail is also changing pretty dramatically in response to recent events. So here's just public opinion, right? Thinking about support for voting by mail. In 1996, for example, about 40% of the public supported voting by mail, and there's no real difference between Democrats and Republicans. 2000, it fell a little bit to about 30%. 2006 is about the same. 2018, really about the same ballpark. But the thing that I think is most critical and most important is that the difference between Democrats and Republicans, it was growing in 2018, but there's not a whole big chasm here. Fast forward to 2020. April 12th, April 20th, April 28th, May 20th, May 20th. And this is by Fox, Gallup, AP, Pew, ABC. And now what you can see, right, is there's dramatic differences. And in particular, there's dramatic differences among Democrats, right, and also independents, that they're much more likely to support voting by mail than they did beforehand. Republicans are arguably maybe, online with what they are. All respondents are going to be higher as well, but that's also driven potentially by Democratic responses here. And so we had a process where Democrats and Republicans had very similar views about vote by mail to go into a world in 2020 where now it's very politicized, right? Democrats have very different views from Republicans, and in fact are far more supportive than Republicans as well. So this raises the question, of course, about what the impact of this is. Now, it's really hard to know, is the short answer. I mean, if you think about how you might go about figuring out whether or not vote by mail advantages Democrats or Republicans, it's a very difficult question, because you just can't see who votes by mail and who votes by early, because that precludes the possibility that people who are voting by mail would nonetheless vote on Election Day, right? So making a composition about how that changes the election could be really problematic. And so this is a real problem if you're a candidate, right? Or if you're a consultant to a candidate. They always face a question about how early voting is doing and what that means about Election Day. So I remember back in 2016 talking to campaign consultants talking about how the Election Day, the early vote was looking really good for Secretary Clinton in Florida, right? And they thought they were going to win the state because of the early vote. And it turns out not so much, right? Because it just turned out that people who would have voted on Election Day were casting their votes early. So Election Day vote went down because the early vote was going up. And so you can't just look to see what's the composition of people who vote early and people who vote on Election Day to assess the impact of vote by mail, because you don't know how they would have voted if they didn't have that option. So here is just one paper that was recently done to give you a little bit of a flavor about one attempt to give an answer to what the effect of vote by mail may be. And so what they do is pretty clever. So they use the fact that Washington, Utah, and California rolled out vote by mail, right? The option to vote by mail, county by county, right? And so what they can do then is say, how does a county who just got vote by mail introduced to themselves differ to how they voted in the prior election when they didn't have vote by mail? So it's within a state, looking within a county to see how the composition of the electorate is changing in response to the vote by mail, right? So again, it's trying to make an apples-to-apples comparison by saying the same voters are living in the same counties, but one election they had the option to vote by mail, the others they did not. So again, making causal inferences in social science is really, really hard, but this is arguably one attempt to try to do so, right? To try to see how the rollout by vote by mail in these three states affected the composition of the electorate. So what they show here is that how people vote change the composition of the electorate. So this says that within a county, how is going to vote by mail affect the percentage of Democrats in the electorate who are voting? So what this says is that in 3 elections before, right, there was no real difference there. 2 elections before, so this is before they get vote by mail, there's a slight increase. 1 election before, and so this is when vote by mail was actually implemented. So what to see is that you can see that over time, these counties are becoming increasingly Democratic, right? A larger percentage of the electorate was Democratic. But moreover, if you look to see what happened after vote by mail was implemented, it turned out that the percentage of Democrats increased by about 1%, right? So it increased, but it wasn't a dramatic increase, right? And it was just following existing trends that seemed to be those counties seem to be getting more Democratic as it were. So it's a little hard to know whether this is due to just the natural trends of those states and the party composition there, or whether this was unique to voting by mail. What we do see an effect of is in terms of how turnout changes. And so this shows you how turnout changed with the introduction of voting by mail. And what you can see is that when vote by mail was introduced, turnout increased by more than 4%. So if you look over time, there's not real strong evidence that things are becoming highly politicized, right? Although, to be clear, there is a Democratic effect here of about 1%. But we do see a much larger effect is the number of voters who are voting. And that's roughly about 4%. So again, this is one study. It's a very important and complicated question, but looking at those states that have gone from voting in person to voting by mail, there seems to be suggestive evidence that it affects turnout, but doesn't necessarily affect the partisan composition of the electorate. But again, this is just one study recently done, and more evidence is needed, but that's, so far as I can tell, the best statement we have to date as to what the causal effect of vote by mail is on the composition of the electorate. So this question about vote by mail versus voting in person raises the important question about how do you vote in person, right? So again, this is all left to the state, if not sometimes even the county boards. So when you go to vote on election day, you need to vote at a polling place. So the number of polling places that exist is a function of the state legislature. They determine how much funding they get. And where those are located is also subject to the determinations of either the county board or the state board. So again, recall Shelby County versus Holder, it used to be that the federal government had to oversee those decisions, right? So if Georgia wanted to change where its polling places were located, it had to get approval from the Department of Justice. No longer is that the case. So again, states are free to determine where they're able to locate their polling places and how many polling places to have. So now, surprisingly, this has dramatic effects because the number of polling places where they're located and how many are being located could vary across states and even within states. So here's looking at the average wait time from 2014 and 2018. And you can see that, again, there's wide variety. In some places like Wyoming and South Dakota, right, the average wait time of a voter in 2014 and 2018 was roughly similar and less than 5 minutes, right? Voting was relatively easy. In other states, so Georgia, to take an extreme example, the wait time in 2014 was roughly 6 minutes, and in 2018, that increased to more than 20 minutes for the average voter. So, and there's South Carolina, Nevada, DC, Texas, Indiana, Arkansas, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, Florida, right? So you can go down the list and see there's dramatically differences that if you go to the polls on election day, right, how long you're gonna have to wait in polling line could vary dramatically. And again, that's a function of the state legislatures empowering state election boards or county election boards to determine where those polling places are and how many of them that exist. And so here's just the distribution, right, of all 41,000 different observations in terms of the line length across 3,119 voting locations in the 2018 election. So again, this isn't all precincts, but just 3,000 of them. And you can see the number of people that were in line at any given point when they looked at it. So most of them, right, roughly 70% had less than 5 people in line, right? So not a long line. But there's some places, right, and this is the shots you always see on election day, where there's like 80 people, 75 people in line at the time when they were done.
While all of this racial reckoning is going on, it's really easy to forget that this is also an election year. Last night, Democrats and Republicans lined up to vote in Georgia's primary elections. And when I say lined up, I mean they lined up.
Today, voters in Georgia were met with long lines and confusion at polling places as they tried to cast ballots in the state's primary elections.
From the air, you could see long lines of Georgia voters, socially distanced, stretching through parking lots.
Voters reported standing in the hot sun for up to 4 hours.
It's an extremely long wait. I've seen lots of people leave, don't have it understanding employers.
We got to do better when it comes to voting. This is a crisis in our world to make us not exercise our right to vote. Please, God, help us.
God, did you see those lines? That didn't look like a voting day. It looked like the last scene in Us. And by the way, kudos to that white woman for using her complaining superpowers to defend democracy. We need to see more of that. Instead of all these white women you see complaining that their iced tea is too cold. Because whether you're black, white, Republican, or Democrat, nobody should have to struggle to vote. I think we can all agree on that. Nobody should have to wait 4 hours to vote. This is an election, not the latest pair of Jordans. And that's what yesterday was. It was a struggle, an unnecessary struggle. And the reason it went wrong is because of everything.
Georgia, a key battleground state in November, had rescheduled its primary twice because of the coronavirus pandemic. Health concerns kept many longtime poll workers from showing up today, leaving inexperienced volunteers to run new voting machines for the first time.
Polling precincts that were at churches, assisted living centers, and senior centers had to be moved because of the coronavirus.
Georgia's Secretary of State, who oversees the election, is blaming local officials, saying poll workers were not properly trained.
The employees didn't understand the system. So what were they doing for all these months? All of a sudden they wake up and they say, let's have an election on Tuesday?
One county official firing back at the Secretary of State, saying if there was a failure of leadership, it starts where the buck should stop, at the top. Now Georgia's Secretary of State has launched an investigation ahead of November's election.
So again, where you live can have dramatic consequences on how much time it takes to cast your ballot on election day, which is in part one reason why we're seeing an increasing number in the people who are choosing to vote early or by absentee or vote by mail when they're given the option to do so. So again, there's tremendous variation that varies by state in the ability to vote on election day based on the decisions that the states themselves are making about how to allocate polling places. So this can also have racial consequences, right? So in particular, so this is a result of some economists who did some work using smartphone data. So we all know our smartphones are tracking where we go all the time. And so what they did is they saw how long individual smartphones were staying at their polling place. And in particular, how long they were staying at their polling place, depending upon whether or not the neighborhood was entirely black or entirely white, or kind of how it varied by racial composition. So what this graph shows, and again, it's more advanced than you need to know. Kernel density is not going to be a pop quiz on that. But what the general shows is that you see that those polling places with the highest fraction black voters, the 10th percentile, right, are generally above the red line, which is those polling places with the lowest percentage of black voters. So in particular, in entirely black neighborhoods, these authors find that it took 29% more time to vote on average. And in fact, 74% more likely to spend more than 30 hours waiting to vote on election day. So again, the decisions that are being made about where polling places are located can have disproportionate impacts by race, right, among other things. So again, the decisions that are being made can have consequences for who's able to vote and how easily you are able to vote, on election day. So another critical issue is, what does the ballot look like that you're voting on, right? So the issue of how the ballot looks like is, again, subject to the decisions being made at the local level. We don't have a national ballot. Instead, every ballot varies county by county. So here's a pop quiz. Here's one ballot that was put before voters to vote for local judges. And you tell me how you vote. It's impenetrable. It's unbelievable. So here you have different candidates. You're voting for these circuit court judges. And what you're supposed to take this pencil and knock out the piece of paper where that voter is. And you tell me what the ability is to do that. I mean, I can't even do that standing right here looking at it, trying to figure out which arrow goes to which dot. And on election day, when you're standing in line, you got other places to be, other things to do, you can only imagine the confusion that might happen here. So again, this is a ballot design, but you can imagine this affecting how you vote, right? And the ability to vote, and whether you're able to vote for the right candidate, right? So if you really want to vote for Ronald Riley, right, 246 yes, I guess it's that one, right? But you can easily imagine, choosing a different dot. Surely they would never use such a crazy ballot to do something important. False, right? So this harkens back to before your time, right? But not my time. So this is Palm Beach County in the 2000 election in Florida, right? Because it's Florida. And so here voters were confronted with a choice. You want to vote for, here's the Republican platform, here's the Democratic platform, here's Pat Buchanan, the Reform platform. And what voters were asked to do is that when you want to vote for your president, you have to go and you have to push which ballot you want. So note what happens is that the polls that you're faced with are different from the orders which you would naturally read. So in particular, if you want to vote for President Bush, right, you do that one right there. If you want to vote for Al Gore, you're supposed to press this one, the third hole down. If you want to vote for Pat Buchanan, you're supposed to do the second one. But when you read it, right, this is right after, and so the worry is that voters may inappropriately push this one. Right? So voters who might intend to vote for Al Gore could actually fill in the ballot that's associated with Pat Buchanan and the Reform Party. So again, this is a ballot reform, but ballot issue, and you can imagine this might be consequential. So to put this in additional context, when the voters went into the voting booth, and this was before the age of electronic ballots, this is what they were literally confronted with. You have this book, you've got this little stylus that's off the side, you punch the card, you hopefully knock out the Chad, right, that's associated with that, and you're good to go. At the end of the day, the election, the 2000 presidential election, was decided by 579 votes. Right? Really, really close. Right? And that gave Bush the presidency because he won the state of Florida and he won all the Electoral College votes.
From ABC News, This Week with Sam Donaldson and Cokie Roberts.
An election in turmoil, a presidency in the balance, a nation waits. Who will emerge the winner in the historic Florida recount? We'll get the latest and speak with the man leading George Bush's efforts there, former Secretary of State James Baker. And we'll hear from Al Gore's advisor, former Secretary of State Warren Christopher.
Plus, once someone does win, how will he get anything done? And how long can this standoff last? We'll ask two of Washington's most seasoned politicians, House Democratic Leader Dick Gephardt and Bob Dole, former Senate Majority Leader.
That's This Week with George Will and George Stephanopoulos. Now from Washington, Sam Donaldson. And from Tallahassee, Florida, Cokie Roberts.
Welcome to our program. Here in Florida, the presidential contest gets tighter by the hour. With the new counts going on, ABC News has an unofficial tally now that George Bush leads by 279 votes. That's unofficial, but it's very close. And last night, in the middle of the night in Palm Beach County, election officials decided to count all of the ballots by hand. That's more than 400,000 votes. ABC's Jackie Judd is in Palm Beach. She joins us now. Jackie?
Good morning, Cokie. The canvassing commissioners did spend all day, all night recounting by hand 1% of the vote, with particular attention, of course, to those ballots that had been cast, but the machine had counted as no vote. When all was said and done, Gore gained 33 votes, Bush gained 14. That was a net gain for Gore of 19 votes. So one of the canvassing commissioners came out to cameras and said, look, if Gore gained 19 votes from 1% of those being recounted, it is conceivable that he could gain 1,900 if everything was recounted. And so she then called for a county-wide hand count of all the ballots.
I believe the people of Palm Beach County have entrusted us with the power to voice their right to participate in their government. And given the totality of the circumstances here, I move that this board conduct a manual recount of all the ballots for the presidential election for the year 2000.
Quite honestly, this is a situation that I think is new to everyone. I believe we have the authority to request of the Secretary of State or Department of Elections an advisory opinion, and it would be my intent as chair to do that.
Ultimately, there was some more debate. The commission did vote, though, 2-1 for that recount. Cokie?
Jackie, how were those votes counted?
Do you have an hour? I can explain it. It was pretty complicated. First, you have to know that the punch hole is called a Chad. It is attached to the ballot by 4 threads. In the morning, the commissioners had decided that if it had been detached by only 1 thread, it would not be counted as a vote. 2 detachments, maybe. 3 definitely counted as a vote. At some point in the process, that was changed. And the commissioners decided that any Chad that was detached to any degree would be counted as a vote.
The same.
Now, there are 2 other strange sounding categories that were not counted as votes. The first one is called the dimpled Chad. That is that there is an indentation in the Chad. The voter put some pressure on it, but didn't detach it at all from the ballot, not counted. The final category is the pregnant Chad. That is, the Chad was pierced with a hole, but not detached at all. Those were not counted. Now, the Republicans here, Koki, seized on all of this confusion. They said, see, we told you this is a deeply flawed process. It must stop. But as we know, the county commissioners here have decided not to stop. They will go for a full recount beginning tomorrow.
Well, it does sound quite interesting, Jackie. Thank you.
So we can ask ourselves, is it possible or is it likely that this design of the ballot impacted the outcome of that election? Right? Is it possible that voters who wanted to vote for Vice President Al Gore inadvertently pushed the button for reform candidate Pat Buchanan when casting their ballot? So again, we don't know for certain, but here's the results of one study. Right? So what they did is they tried to compare, well, how does the amount of votes being cast for Buchanan, like how different are they? Controlling for demographics, controlling how that county voted for the past, controlling for all your favorite variables that you might think might explain support for Pat Buchanan. Right? And what they found is that in Palm Beach, Florida, of the 3,047 votes that Pat Buchanan received, they estimate about 2,800 of those were likely mistakes. So 2,800 votes, and a margin of 547 votes, was thought to be a mistake for Buchanan because he did so much better than you predicted. Right? It's interesting to note, right, that the other outlying county you see here from Jasper, South Carolina, they actually closed a polling place down there because they realized their voting tabulation machine was broken that only recorded one vote for Vice President Al Gore and one vote for President Bush. And so the number of votes that Buchanan got in Palm Beach County was greater than a place where they knew the voting machine was broken, right, in terms of the precinct and in terms of how it was counting the votes. So again, it doesn't prove anything, right, but it's highly suggestive that the ballot design that the Palm Beach County decided to use, right, which is a Democratic-run county, by the way, probably caused some voters to vote for Pat Buchanan mistakenly when they actually intended to vote for Vice President Al Gore. That difference would be sufficiently great to basically change the outcome of the presidential election. Again, we don't know that for certain, but based on how much different Pat Buchanan's vote share was in Palm Beach relative to every other place in the country, it seems plausible that that's the case. But clearly we figured this out. And surely Florida's figured this out, right? Not so fast. So again, let's harken back to 2018 November. So here we had a very closely contested race in the Senate contest here between former Governor Rick Scott and Bill Nelson. So the final results had Rick Scott with a margin of about 13,000 votes. They did a machine recount, which is just taking all the votes and making sure the machines didn't print out the wrong numbers. That led to a margin of 12,603, so Rick Scott's lead actually increased a little bit. And then they started doing a manual recount that showed that there were some votes that were not counted by the machine that you could pick up manually. That kind of narrowed the margin to 10,000 votes. So again, a very, very close election. Was kind of sued in the courts to kind of make sure that it is valid, and the results were verified. Rick Scott is now the senator of Florida, right, with a 10,000 vote margin. But the issue is that if you look at the Broward County ballot, there's reason to be worried. So in particular, this is the actual ballot that was used. And what you can see is that in the first column, you have all of these instructions, right? Blah, 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 blah. Lots of different language, like lots of instructions. At the very end of that column is where you vote for Senate. Then up here is you vote for the governor. So what that means is that voters just skipped the first column because they assumed it was all the instructions, they may have missed voting for them in the Senate contest in Florida. And they may have started voting here with the governor races. So again, we can't prove anything here, right? But we can say that is the way the ballot is designed, does it make some individuals, more likely to basically miss voting in the Senate race and start voting in the governor's race. So we can look by that by seeing how many people cast votes for the governor's race but failed to vote for the Senate race. Right? So how many places or how many individuals was there not a vote in the Senate contest? So here, if you look across all the different counties, so we can kind of see county by county in Florida, how many missing votes were cast in the Senate race in Broward County versus every other county in Florida. And what you can see is that there was 3.7% fewer votes cast for the U.S. Senate than the governor. So what that means is that 3.7% forgot to vote or didn't vote for the US Senate contest when they did vote for the governor contest. And so the fact that we had 3.7% of the votes missing for the Senate contest relative to the governor contest, and the fact that that's so much different than every other county suggests that the ballot design may have had a role to play there. So in particular, we're missing a lot of votes. And it may be, right, that 3.7% of the people in Broward County decided they didn't want to vote for the Senate contest, but it seems plausible that they missed that, right? They assumed that was all the information. They just started voting at the governor's contest. And so is that consequential? Well, that was 3.7% resulted in 26,000 votes. So again, the margin was 10,000 votes between Scott and Nelson. Roughly 26,000 people in Broward County didn't vote in the Senate contest. Now, we can't say they all would vote for one way or the other. We don't know how they would actually vote. But the fact that the number of people who didn't vote, right, is nearly 3 times as the margin highlights the importance of simple things such as the ballot design can have on the outcome of elections. So again, that's all determined not at the state level here, but this is determined at the county level. Highlighting again the real critical importance of the decisions being made not at the national government, but at the state and local levels, and how that impacts the ability of not only individuals to vote, but then make sure that what they think or who they support is counted on election day. So what this all shows is that voting is not equally easy. Yes, we live in the United States, but the states are not united in the technologies and the processes they use on election day. So you can go and try to quantify this in some sense by looking at how states may vary. So this is a bunch of scholars who went through and looked at issues related to registration deadlines, pre-registration laws, voting inconvenience, voter ID laws, and the number of poll hours to try to see how easy is it to vote in various states. And the story they tell you is, again, one that there's tremendous variation here. Some states, it's really easy to vote. So Oregon, with vote by mail, super easy. There's the easiest state to vote in any place in the country. Tennessee is the 40th most difficult. Mississippi is the 50th most difficult, right? And so other places, depending on how long you have to be registered prior to election day or how you're able to vote on election day, it can be much more complicated. So again, this isn't to get into saying the consequence of the partisanship or kind of whether these things are good or bad, but it is to make the point that there's tremendous variation that occurs at the state level because of how the states choose to allow the voting to occur in those states. So again, understanding the right to vote and the ability to vote is going to vary tremendously upon the states that you live in and the power of those state legislatures to regulate those and the desire of the state legislatures to regulate those rules. So again, even though we have a national election, in reality, those elections occur state by state. And because the Constitution gives the power to state legislatures, as a result, the ability to vote varies dramatically depending upon where you live. So let's step back. There's 2 big points to emphasize here, although we did a lot of different details. But the bigger points to recall is that 1, all elections are local. And they're local in the sense that the rules by which voters participate vary tremendously by states, and intentionally so. So we call in the Constitution that all power to regulate the time and the manner of the election was given to state legislatures, in part to protect against an overly strong federal government, although sometimes we've seen the federal government insert itself. So that means that there's very large differences across states. What election day looks like in Tennessee is very different from what it looks like in New York State, or in Oregon, or California, or Texas. So those differences matter. And that highlights the second point, is that the rules matter. The rules by which states use to regulate their election in terms of whose registration, how you vote, and who's able to vote are hugely consequential for elections and determining election outcomes. So understanding the importance of that variation and how that variation exists and came to be is all critically important. So this hopefully gives you a little bit of high-level overview. We didn't get into a discussion about whether these are good or bad. Again, that's not the point of this lecture. It's just to make you aware that variation exists, and that variation is likely consequential for understanding the nature of elections that we see in the United States today.